Until E20 started making headlines, most of us never really thought about fuel. We filled up our tanks, looked at the price, maybe complained about it, and drove away. Very few of us ever stopped to ask, what's actually inside this petrol? Then suddenly, E20 was everywhere because behind this one fuel lies a much bigger story. A story about economics, farmers, automobile manufacturers, government policy, and ultimately, every single person who owns a petrol vehicle. Beneath all the headlines, very few people were asking a much simpler question. What exactly changed? If E20 is truly better, why don't consumers get a choice? If part of our petrol is now being replaced with ethanol produced in India, why haven't fuel prices become noticeably cheaper? And if this transition is ultimately good for India's economy and the environment, was the nationwide rollout handled the right way? These aren't just questions about a new fuel. They're questions about public policy, consumer choice, and the future of transportation in India. Every time you fill your tank, you're not just buying fuel. You're buying a product that has traveled thousands of kilometers before reaching your vehicle. The problem is, India doesn't produce enough crude oil to meet its own needs. For decades, the country has relied heavily on imports to keep its economy moving. In fact, nearly 9 out of every 10 liters of crude oil used to make petrol comes from outside India. That means every spike in global oil prices, every geopolitical conflict, and every disruption to international supply chains has the potential to affect India's fuel bill. So the government began looking for a solution closer to home. That's where ethanol came in. Today, at many fuel stations across India, what you're filling isn't just petrol anymore. It's E20. The name is surprisingly simple. The letter E stands for ethanol, and the number 20 means the fuel contains 20% ethanol and 80% petrol. That ethanol is produced from sugarcane, maize, damaged food grains, and, increasingly, agricultural waste. Under the government's E20 program, it now makes up 1/5 of every liter of petrol sold across India. So, if 20% of our fuel is now produced at home, why hasn't petrol become cheaper? Because E20 was never introduced to make petrol cheaper. Its primary purpose was to reduce India's dependence on imported crude oil and strengthen the country's energy security. The government purchases ethanol from producers at administered prices to ensure farmers and distilleries receive a fair return. For example, maize-based ethanol is procured at around 71.86 rupees per liter, even before GST, transportation, storage, and blending costs are added. In fact, according to the government's own estimates, when global crude oil prices are around $70 per barrel, producing E20 can cost just as much as, or even more than, conventional petrol. Ethanol only becomes the cheaper component when crude oil prices rise significantly to around $120 to $130 per barrel. So the real advantage of E20 isn't cheaper petrol, it is stability. Instead of relying entirely on imported crude oil, 1/5 of every fuel tank now comes from a stable, domestically produced source, helping shield India from global oil price shocks while strengthening the country's energy security. So, if E20 is really the future, why don't we get a choice? After all, we can choose between regular and premium petrol. We can choose between petrol and diesel. So why can't we choose between E10 and E20? The answer lies in something far less visible than the fuel itself, the infrastructure behind it. Supplying 2 different grades of petrol across a country the size of India isn't as simple as filling a different nozzle. It would require separate storage tanks, transportation, pipelines, quality control, and a far more complex distribution network across thousands of fuel stations. From the government's perspective, A single nationwide fuel standard makes the entire system simpler, more efficient, and far easier to scale. If E20 was going to become the new standard across India, what would it actually do to the millions of vehicles already on the road? To answer that, researchers from the Automotive Research Association of India, the Indian Institute of Petroleum, and Indian Oil's Research and Development Center carried out one of India's earliest comprehensive studies on E20 fuel compatibility. The findings were more balanced than many people expected. Let's start with what didn't change. The metal components inside the engine showed no compatibility issues. Vehicles started normally in both hot and cold conditions, drove normally, and completed extensive road trials without any major malfunctions or engine stalls. Even after prolonged testing, researchers found no abnormal engine wear, no unusual carbon deposits, and no deterioration of engine oil. But the study also found that not everything remained unaffected. Some rubber seals and certain plastic components showed faster degradation when exposed to E20 over time. And because ethanol contains less energy per liter than petrol, fuel economy dropped by as much as 6%, depending on the type of vehicle. The conclusion wasn't that E20 was unsafe. It was that the fuel and the vehicles needed to evolve together. The report recommends that higher ethanol blends should be paired with vehicles specifically engineered for them using ethanol-compatible materials, revised engine calibration, and optimized compression ratios. Only then can the higher octane rating of ethanol be fully utilized while minimizing the drawbacks. The government of India mandated that all petrol vehicles manufactured from 1st April 2023 onwards must be E20 material compatible. And it also said that the existing vehicles can continue operating on E20 with routine maintenance. But India wasn't originally expected to reach E20 until 2030. Yet, the target was achieved 5 years ahead of schedule. So, what changed? According to the government, ethanol production expanded much faster than anticipated. Manufacturers had several years to prepare, and every year of delay meant another year of dependence on imported crude oil. From that perspective, there was little reason to wait. Critics, however, tell a different story. They argue that while the fuel may have been ready, millions of consumers and older vehicles were still in the middle of the transition. Many legacy vehicles remained on Indian roads when E20 became widely available. In many places, consumers gradually lost the option to choose lower ethanol blends. Public awareness about vehicle compatibility, fuel economy, and long-term implications remained limited. And although the 2021 Niti Aayog roadmap proposed a carefully phased transition, some believe the practical rollout moved faster than parts of the ecosystem were prepared for. Notice something important. These criticisms aren't necessarily about ethanol blending itself. They're about how the transition was implemented. And that's an important distinction. E20 is a policy driven by the right intention, reducing India's dependence on imported crude oil, strengthening energy security, supporting domestic agriculture, and lowering emissions are all objectives worth pursuing. On paper, the policy had a compelling objective, but a good policy isn't judged only by its intention, it's judged by its implementation. And in the case of E20, the transition appears to have moved faster than parts of the ecosystem were prepared for, leaving consumers and owners of older vehicles to adapt alongside the policy.
However, there seems to be high political drama that is unfolding in the national capital ahead of the proposed E20 protest, where the centre has sought to allay the concerns over the policy, and the politics, however, continues to intensify on the ground.